The Blitz from the archives. Run for cover. On September 7th, 1940, a new and horrifying chapter in the history of Britain began. The Blitz, as bombs rained down on London from waves of Luftwaffe planes, the scale and savagery of World War II came crashing into the homes and lives of thousands of innocent civilians. Countless homes, businesses, communications networks, factories, and, most valuable of all, families would be destroyed. Throughout the course of the Nazi terror raid, a campaign aimed at obliterating the nation's morale and forcing the British government to sue for peace. The people of Britain proved far more resilient than Hitler could ever have anticipated. Steeling themselves against the relentless bombing, they stood tall and vowed to carry on. Their courage and collective spirit an unbeatable force that would unite a nation. From volunteer firefighters to air raid wardens, RAF night fighters, and even Girl Scouts, men, women and children across the country braved bombs and blasts to do their bit, building shelters, battling infernos and hunting the enemy in an effort to defy the threat of fascism. Get ready to dodge the bombs, man the searchlights and immerse yourself in their story. A brutal struggle that may have ended over 80 years ago, but still echoes to this day. A quick look at two areas. The photograph on the right is a map of the Blitz, showing 12 places that were affected badly. 1. Black Saturday. 2. Birmingham Blitz. 3. Liverpool's agony. 4. Coventry Blitz. 5. Bristol Blitz. 6. Sheffield Blitz. 7. Manchester Blitz. 8. Cardiff Blitz. 9. Clydebank Blitz. 10. Plymouth Blitz. 11. Belfast Blitz. 12. The Hardest Night. 7. Manchester Blitz was hit by nights of air raids that killed 684 people when the Trafford Park industrial area was targeted. The city's infrastructure was badly damaged, with both of its main railway stations and bus station being hit. 2 major roads were blocked while water and electricity supplies were severely disrupted. 12. The Hardest Night. London suffered its most devastating raid. 1,436 people are killed, and the destruction is double that of the 1666 Great Fire in London. Over 43,500 civilians were killed across Britain, although there is some respite from June 1941, when the Luftwaffe directs its attentions towards the USSR and the Mediterranean Sea. More raids. Cardiff Blitz. 100 Luftwaffe aircraft conducted a 10-hour raid in which 165 people were killed and 350 homes were destroyed. Among the many buildings damaged was Llandaff Cathedral. Clydebank Blitz. The industrial town of Clydebank suffered 2 nights of raids, which are referred to as a major disaster. Overcrowded tenement housing and inadequate air raid shelters resulted in 35,000 people being made homeless out of a population of 50,000. 10. The Plymouth Blitz. The naval base at Devonport was targeted by the Luftwaffe, but nearby Plymouth suffered severe damage. Over 900 were killed and 40,000 were made homeless. The city's Guildhall was destroyed, along with several churches and shopping streets. 11. The Belfast Blitz. The Luftwaffe conducted 4 raids over the Northern Irish capital, which was a major shipbuilding, insufficient shelters and anti-aircraft guns resulted in high casualties, including 900 killed on April 15, 1941. Raging fires resulted in fire crews being dispatched from air and mainland Britain. 2. The Birmingham Blitz. Raids steadily increased against Birmingham from August 1940 and reached a crescendo on the night of November 19 to 20. Dozens were killed when the important Birmingham Small Arms Works was hit, while 400 tons of high explosive bombs are dropped on the city. Even more raids. Black Saturday. The Blitz began in earnest when 348 Luftwaffe bombers, accompanied by 617 fighters, attacked the port of London. Bombs and incendiary devices were dropped on strategically important areas such as the Royal Docks. Approximately 460 people were killed, with a further 1,600 being injured. 3. Liverpool's agony. Merseyside became the most bombed area outside London and was often hit on consecutive nights. In May 1941, the area was bombed almost continuously for 8 days. 1,900 people were killed, 1,450 were wounded, and approximately 70,000 were made homeless. 5. The Bristol Blitz. With a strategic dock on England's west coast, Bristol was also home to aircraft factories. On November 24, 1940, a raid left over 200 dead and destroyed many historic buildings, including churches, almshouses and timber-framed structures. 4. The Coventry Blitz. Around 503 tons of high explosive and 30,000 incendiary bombs were dropped on the relatively small industrial city of Coventry. Around 1/3 of its houses became uninhabitable. 568 people were killed. The city's medieval cathedral was destroyed. 6. The Sheffield Blitz. The city centre suffered severe damage. 750 people were killed and almost 3,000 homes and businesses were destroyed. Victory in September. By the time September 1940 rolled round, as the brutal and bloody British summer neared its end, Fighter Command and the Luftwaffe were both starting to sweat. On the final day of August alone, the British lost 40 planes and 9 pilots, with 18 more badly wounded. The battle of attrition over the skies of Britain was taking a heavy toll, and the attacks kept rolling in, one after another, killing scores of pilots, destroying planes, and dealing blow after blow to the island's key sector stations. As September broke, things were so bad that Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding could no longer rotate his 11 group squadrons so they could rest. After absorbing yet another day of attacks, 11th Group Commander Keith Park personally convinced Winston Churchill that Britain could endure. His careful strategy of deploying small squadrons and targeting bombers had proved a wise one. In the process, the Luftwaffe had suffered grave losses, dwindling down from 900 fighters to 735, while somehow the RAF grew. Though the Germans enjoyed superior numbers, the campaign was draining away their most experienced pilots. The British were narrowing the gap. Despite Germany's superior access to labour and materials, between June and September, Britain produced 1,900 fighters, compared to Germany's 775. The first raids. Winston Churchill said, "These cruel, wanton, indiscriminate bombings of London are part of Hitler's invasion plans. He hopes that he will cow the people of this city. Little does he know the spirit of the British nation or the tough fibre of the Londoners." The onset of the Blitz ravaged London and other cities, stealing the resolve of the British people. On the 10th, German bombs fell on fashionable Chelsea, and an explosive struck the north side of Buckingham Palace, where the royal family were in residence. Churchill turned to Air Vice Marshal Keith Park, commander of 11th Group, and asked, "What reserves have we?" Park replied, "There are none." The date, Sunday, September 15, 1940, forever remembered as the Battle of Britain Day, was the high watermark of the Nazi effort to defeat the RAF and control the air over the English Channel, paving the way for Operation Sea Lion, the long-expected German invasion of Great Britain. Another Luftwaffe raid might have broken the back of the RAF, but it did not come. It was a near-run thing. Hitler postponed Operation Sea Lion. On the night of August 24th, a few German planes drifted off course and dropped their bombs on London East End. Churchill responded by sending RAF bombers against Berlin the following night. Furious that Britain had been able to strike the German capital, Hitler flew into a rage and sanctioned the terror bombing that followed. In a bitterly ironic twist, the Nazis squandered their best opportunity to win the Battle of Britain. The shift from RAF airfields to British cities gave the beleaguered RAF some much-needed breathing room to recover and replace the losses from weeks of air combat and ultimately defeat the Luftwaffe. Propaganda engines cranked up on both sides, claiming wildly exaggerated kill figures. Actually, German losses were 60 planes, while 29 RAF fighters failed to return to their bases. For the Germans, the losses were grievous enough that it was apparent that the battle was lost. On September 17th, Hitler postponed Operation Sea Lion. The British people resolved to hold out under the terror bombing. The motto, "London can take it," was frequently repeated, but by late September, an estimated 180,000 Londoners were spending the nights in shelters, many in the tunnels of the underground transit system. As German bombers droned overhead, one Manchester father told his son, "That's a Jerry, I can tell by the engine." Anti-aircraft defences. The British government didn't have much confidence in their ability to stop German bombs raining down. Experts predicted the Luftwaffe would drop 3,500 tons of bombs in the first 24 hours of the conflict. Weeks of follow-up raids would continue the devastation. Hospitals were told to expect 300,000 casualties. Plans were drawn up to help the authorities cope with 250,000 burials. Despite the dire warnings, the country's 7 anti-aircraft divisions were poorly equipped. They were manned by the Territorial Army rather than regular units. Little effort went into training fighter pilots for night combat. Rather than try to stop bombing raids as they happened, the RAF hoped to remove the ability of the Luftwaffe to launch raids at all by destroying airfields, aircraft factories and fuel refineries. Yet this was not a plan with much chance of success. RAF bombers lacked the ability to its target so accurately, and Germany was churning out huge numbers of new aircraft. Air raid sirens plus barrage balloons. When the Blitz began, the RAF had a fleet of 1,400 barrage balloons. See the top photograph, flying above Britain, a third of which defended London. They protected cities against the kind of devastation that Luftwaffe dive bombers had unleashed on Guernica in Spain and Rotterdam. Any German pilot foolhardy enough to attempt a low-level bombing run among the barrage balloons risked being snagged by the metal cables tethering the balloons to the ground. Explosives were added that would be automatically detonated if the cable was touched. Although only 24 German planes were brought down by balloon cables, their real impact was greater. The warbling rise and fall of the sirens, see the lower photograph, nicknamed Wailing Winnie or Moaning Minnie, soon became a regular refrain across the country. Every community had a siren, a hand-cranked model in rural areas and electric sirens in larger areas. People were told to make for their nearest shelter when they heard them. Blackout. As dusk fell on the day Germany invaded Poland on September 1st, 1939, Britain went dark. It remained so for almost 6 years. The hope was a nighttime blackout would prevent German bombers from navigating to and identifying their targets. Windows were covered by blinds, heavy curtains or paint to prevent any glimpse of light escaping. Shops installed airlock-style double doors to allow customers to enter and exit. Street lights were turned off. Vehicle headlights and traffic lights were fitted with slits to deflect beams downwards. Yet these measures may have made life tougher for bomber crews. They also made the streets a more dangerous place to be after dusk. The blackout was one of the most unpopular aspects of the war. Accidents and crime increased. The grumpy shout of an ARP warden complaining about escaping light was common, and the typical fine for repeated breaches was £2. Despite most of Britain going dark, some areas were deliberately lit up. Clever tricks were employed to recreate industrial areas. Red lamps looked like furnaces, and lights were set under thin wooden panels as pretend factory skylights. Just as with the blackout, the aim was to confuse the Germans and divert them from their intended target. Anti-aircraft guns. Anti-aircraft gunners had a difficult job. They hoped to bring down bombers that flew at hundreds of miles an hour and had the ability to alter course and elevation. A high-flying target meant a gunner had to aim 1.8 miles ahead and give the fuse 30 seconds of travel time. It was an almost impossible shot. At the start of the Blitz, around 30,000 shells were fired for every bomber downed. Accuracy did improve. By 1941, that figure had dropped to 4,000. Anti-aircraft emplacements were located around cities, airfields and the south coast. One old battleship gun turret was carried to the top of Primrose Hill, overlooking London Zoo, to help protect the capital. Smaller Bofors Mark III guns could not fire as high, but were useful against lower flying aircraft. They were fitted to the chassis of a lorry to make a mobile emplacement, and a mechanical analog computer could be used to calculate the deflection needed to shoot down a moving target. shelters. The dark days of the Blitz loomed, and residents of Great Britain were advised by their government to prepare appropriate shelters, and the photograph shows a resident emerging from their shelter. Well, that resident was Jimmy Fagan, who eventually settled in Lancaster and was the best centre forward I ever played with. While German bombs threatened widespread death and destruction across major British cities, ordinary life was suspended and back gardens were converted into life-saving shelters. The Anderson Shelter, designed in 1938 by William Patterson and Oscar Kerrison in answer to a directive from the Home Office. The shelter was 1.8 metres high, 1.4 metres wide and 2 metres long. Before the war, the government provided 1.5 million shelters. Those households earning less than £250 a year, there was no charge. The photograph shows, as I've said, Jimmy Fagan at home in Knotty Ash, the town of Kendall, in his back garden in front of the family shelter. Jimmy was the best centre forward I ever played with. He went to Sheffield United as a youngster under the great Joe Mercer, who was a blue, but Jimmy was a red. Morrison shelters. For people who didn't have a garden, they took advantage of the Morrison shelter, an indoor apparatus that resembled a cage and was named after Minister of Home Security Herbert Morrison. It was provided free of charge to households earning under £400 a year. The owner was responsible for assembling the 360 individual parts. 250,000 Morrison shelters were distributed by late 1941, with an additional 100,000 issued by 1943. Many Londoners took refuge in the capital city's underground stations. They offered a great sense of security, as well as companionship and toilet facilities. Eventually, London underground stations were fitted with bunks for up to 22,000 citizens. An estimated 170,000 Londoners took advantage of the underground facilities during the Blitz, and a 1940 survey indicated that only 27% utilised Anderson shelters, 9% public shelters and 4% the underground tunnels. Amazingly, 60% chose to sleep in their own houses. Estimated civilian casualties inflicted by the German bombing from September 1940 to May 1941 included nearly 50,000 killed and up to 140,000 injured, assuring the people of Germany that Britain couldn't hold out indefinitely. The Nazi hierarchy continued to send planes across the Channel, but they hadn't reckoned on the will of the British people to resist. Coventry, a city on fire. Over 85 years ago, one devastating air raid came to symbolise the unprecedented destruction of the Blitz. Eyewitnesses shared their incredible stories of survival and endurance, and the photograph shows civilians walking through the ruins of Coventry while smoke rises. On a clear night during November 14th and 15th, 1940, almost 500 Luftwaffe aircraft conducted an unprecedented bombing raid against the city of Coventry. Codenamed Moonlight Sonata, the raid lasted 11 hours. 500 tons of high explosive, 30,000 incendiary bombs and 50 landmines were dropped in the single most concentrated attack on a British city during World War II. Approximately 570 people were killed, over 1,000 injured. Coventry's biggest loss was material. More than 43,000 homes were photograph shows King George VI walking through the streets of Coventry on November 16, 1940, with Home Secretary Herbert Morrison. The visit was unannounced. Many people were surprised to see him. Once the Luftwaffe departed and the all clear siren sounded on the morning of November 15, families emerged to see a destroyed neighbourhood. They said it was just devastation all around us. All we had were the clothes we wore. No coats. The house was a wreck. You couldn't live in it. And 6 houses near us also had to be vacated. The destruction of the family hall and the stressful upheaval was a great strain on the mother, whose daughter said, "We moved to live with my aunt, but I think the trauma and upset of being in somebody else's house took a toll on my mother. Sadly, she died when she was only 45 of bronchial pneumonia, but she died because of the Blitz." A lost medieval city. Coventry's historic buildings were not just destroyed by the Blitz, but also by interwar and post-war redevelopments. Unlike many other British industrial cities, Coventry had an ancient core with a distinguished past. It had been the 4th wealthiest English city during the late Middle Ages and hosted several parliaments in the 15th century. Before World War II, Coventry city centre was like a Midlands version of York, with many half-timbered houses, narrow streets and its large 14th century cathedral. During the 18th, 19th century, its ancient city gates were dismantled, while a preserved medieval street called Butcher Road was demolished by the local corporation or council in 1936. Nevertheless, the war did inflict grievous damage on Coventry's remaining medieval and Tudor architecture. Even after the war, redevelopers tore down historic buildings to make way for a ring road, so the loss of historic Coventry was not entirely down to the Luftwaffe. However, remarkable examples of Coventry's distant past still survive, such as Holy Trinity Church, St Mary's Guildhall, Ford's Hospital, Spon Street and Christchurch Spire. Even the destroyed St Michael's Cathedral's intact spire remains the 3rd tallest in England at now 90 metres high. RAF night fighters. Over 85 years ago, the Blitz was in full swing, but the RAF was initially all but impotent in its efforts to effectively counter nocturnal raids. However, skilled piloting and technological innovation soon saw the nighttime defenders gain significant victories over the Luftwaffe. When the Luftwaffe abandoned its daylight attacks against airfields, aircraft factories and other parts of Britain's defence infrastructure in early September 1940, turning instead to London and other cities, it was of course a relief to a beleaguered RAF Fighter Command. In many respects, RAF Fighter Command had been wrong-footed as to how it might be required to defend Britain, for all that though nocturnal defence seemed fatally lacking. For the Luftwaffe, which suffered grievous combat losses during the daylight phase of the Battle of Britain, round-the-clock attacks on London at least highlighted one simple fact. Losses of bombers by night were significantly less than those suffered by day. Initially, daylight attacks continued in tandem with night raids. Inevitably, those daylight raids resulted in continued heavy losses by the bomber force, while night bombers remained relatively immune from the limited fighter defences and ineffective anti-aircraft guns. It was not surprising that mass daylight attacks all but petered out by early October. The Blitz wasn't a strategic victory. On the night of June 19th to 20th, 1940, over East Anglia, when Spitfires of 19 and 74 squadrons broke down 3 Heinkel 111s of Camp Freshwerder, they were unusually successes, and night fighter operations by single-seat fighters were as hazardous as they were unproductive. Many pilots were lost on night operations. One was Sergeant House, a Hurricane pilot with the 85 Squadron. He shot down at least 10 enemy aircraft by day, awarded the DFM. He was killed on December 22nd, 1940, after losing control during a futile fighter night patrol. By early 1941, Britain's night fighting capability was in a much better place. In other areas there were developments, among them radar-guided AA guns and radar searchlights. Meanwhile, the Mosquito was under development and ultimately proved a potent night fighter. Even by the spring of 1941, German raiders were statistically unlikely to encounter RAF night fighters. Generally, it is accepted that the Blitz ended on May 11, 1941, coinciding with the colossal German assault on the USSR, codenamed Operation Barbarossa. Although the Blitz failed to bring about the collapse the Germans anticipated, more than 1 million houses were damaged or destroyed, and casualties sustained by the civilian population were nearly 45,000 killed and 50,000 injured. However, the Blitz was far from being a strategic victory. The Second Great Fire of London. In the photograph, a man is seen inspecting the wreckage of a house in Dover that suffered a direct hit during the German air raid. In 1939, the port of Dover boasted a population of over 40,000, but by 1940 this number had dwindled to just 16,500 due to the seemingly imminent threat of an invasion. One of the most deadly and destructive air raids on London during the Blitz, the Second Great Fire caused widespread devastation. On the night of December 29, 1940, at approximately 6:15 p.m, chaos descended on the city of London. Over the course of a single night, the German Luftwaffe deployed 136 bombers with approximately 100,000 bombs over London, their deadly payloads causing fires all over the capital, destroying a large segment of the city. The fires raged and ravished during the night of the 29th and into the 30th. In the space of a few hours, more lives were lost and a greater area burned than in the famous 1666 blaze of the First Great Fire of London. Impact on the nation's children. Entire streets were flattened. 31 guildhalls in the square mile were completely incinerated. The night's fires consumed around 5 million books in Paternoster Square, the centre of the publishing industry. A staggering 17 churches were also damaged. Sadly, only 8 were later rebuilt. Thankfully, the human toll was not as heavy as it could have been. The author Francis Beckett wrote of the courage of the firefighters. Driving vans laden with petrol through the flames that night was about as dangerous a job as you could do. Volunteers and firefighters not only struggled to contain the flames, but also dealt with the hundreds of unexploded bombs from the previous nights of the Blitz. Despite most of the fires being extinguished by the next morning, many raged on for days. That night, 160 civilians and 14 firefighters lost their lives, many of whom succumbed to their injuries and burns in the days that followed. The bombs left millions of homes destroyed and 43,000 civilians dead. They also had a profound impact on the nation's children. Ultimately, it was the strength, bravery and fighting spirit of London's firefighters, volunteers and civilians that combined to save the country's capital city from further ruin. A determination that would serve as an inspiration to all throughout the rest of the Blitz. The Blitz kids. Torn away from their families or kept at home in cities pummeled by bombs, children were forced to face the merciless might of Nazi Germany. The bombs left millions of homes destroyed and 43,000 civilians dead. They also had a profound impact on the children. By the time the Luftwaffe began raining bombs from the air on September 7, 1940, millions of children had already been evacuated from British cities to the safety of the countryside. The British government had acted some 4 days before it declared war on Germany, issuing an order on August 31st, 1939 at 11:07 a.m. to evacuate forthwith. The evacuation was codenamed Operation Pied Piper. During the first few days, 735,000 unaccompanied British kids and 426,000 mothers with children were moved. Evacuation was voluntary. Some were taken on double-decker buses and many were marched to railway stations. Each child carrying their gas mask, ready to begin their journeys on one of the 1,500 special trains that had been laid on. There were harrowing scenes. Children cried for their parents, siblings clung tightly to each other. Many children stayed at home. An emergency order meant that evacuees had to be housed in spare bedrooms, so some foster parents were forced to take children in. As a result, amid the happy recollection of being sent away to the countryside were tales of beatings, enforced work and terrible neglect. On September 18, 1940, a Nazi U-boat sank a liner taking evacuees to Canada, killing 83 children. Bombs tore apart key cities, including London, Coventry, Manchester and Swansea. Had all the children remained behind, the death toll would have been much higher and the strain on air raid shelters immense. The fictional Pied Piper of Hamelin lured children away never to be seen again, but it ensured the majority would eventually return safe and well. Hundreds of thousands of children were not evacuated from the cities, as their families decided it was preferable for them to stay together during the onslaught. It wasn't such a bad idea, as there was evidence following the war that it had actually proved better for them than being moved into the country. Children who stayed behind were less depressed and enjoyed the moments of family intimacy the areas brought. The Blitz spirit never left us. All the children tried to lead as normal a life as possible. A prime example of the infamous Blitz spirit, and it wasn't unusual for them to dice with danger and walk the battered streets away from the arguments that often raged within the shelters. on sleeping in their own homes, preferring to risk their lives beneath the bombers rather than huddle with strangers in dark and smelly places, devoid of even the most basic of toilet facilities. Cities burned and the skies choked with smoke. Night virtually turned to day in the flicker of the flames. Orphans were made in seconds and life was entirely disrupted. German bombers were unflinching and determined to pummel the British into submission, and children would become bitter about the enemy. During 8 months of the first Blitz, over 5,000 children were killed, a devastating toll, and the cost of Hitler's cruel and misguided crusade to crush Britain. Charity Big was a 14-year-old civilian dispatch rider who claimed to be 16 in order to join the ARP in West Bromwich when the town was bombed in 1940. She put out an incendiary bomb with her father that fell through the roof they were on top of and injured herself. She borrowed a bike, dodged further dangers and delivered messages to the control room. She was awarded the George Medal for bravery, becoming the youngest person to ever receive it. The children may have had unconventional childhoods, but their involvement in the war helped shape their future lives. The hardest night. On the night of May 10th to 11th, 1941, London withstood its most devastating raid of the Blitz. The threat of invasion was thwarted. German landing barges would not reach British shores, but the cruel rain of destruction from the air continued. There was a shock of Black Saturday on September 7th, 1940. The great battles a week later, September 15th, then became known as Battle of Britain Day, and 57 straight nights of Luftwaffe raids. Unknown to the weary population and the steadfast pilots of the RAF at the time, the end of the Blitz was near as Hitler turned his attention toward the pending invasion of the Soviet Union. Despite heroic defense, the German bombers delivered their cargoes of death and destruction for 7 hours, finally going to their bases on the continent at 6 a.m. A total of 571 sorties were flown. More than 700 tons of high explosive bombs plummeted like devils across the beleaguered British capital. German bombs struck both Houses of Parliament, destroying the House of Commons. Never, never, never give in. The upper photograph shows the destruction of St Thomas's Hospital. Big Ben and Parliament are in the distance. The lower photograph shows Prime Minister Winston Churchill surveying bomb damage in South London. Novelist William Sanson noted, "In the morning there was nothing left of the famous house but a charred, black, smouldering, steaming ruin. The Speaker's chair was lost. The green padded leather lines of seats were charred and drenched. With them the chamber, its press gallery, its strangers and ladies' galleries." Sanson went on to say, "The senses were assaulted, and the destruction in the morning air, an invisible veil of plaster dust, hung its odour over the air of every street. Bombed or not bombed, the whole of Westminster was impregnated with it. The law courts and Westminster Abbey were damaged. Westminster School, Westminster Hall and Big Ben were also struck, but Londoners coped with the devastation, mourned and buried their dead, and remained committed to the eventual victory over Nazi tyranny. The whole population was also photograph on the right is a copy of Baedeker's famous red-covered guides, a common sight on bookshelves in both Germany and Britain throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. On May 13th, 2016, builders working at a former junior school in Bath were digging up what had once been a children's playground when they came across something sinister. As they cleared the earth away from the metre-long metal cylinder, it became clear that what they were looking at was a terrifying relic from a darker age, an unexploded 550-pound German bomb that had been dropped in April 1942, a bomb that still had the potential to obliterate anything within a 50-yard radius. Army explosives experts dealt with the bomb safely, but its discovery unearthed a story that had been buried for nearly 75 years, the events of the so-called Baedeker raids. The answer lies almost 900 miles to the east, in the German city of Lübeck on the Baltic Sea coast. Bomber Harris appointed. With Britain's army almost swept into the sea at Dunkirk, without a foothold in continental Europe, Churchill believed the RAF's fighters may be our salvation, but the bombers alone provide us with the means of victory. Germany, he decided, could be blasted into submission. To complete the task, a new breed of heavy bomber was rushed into production, the Admiral Lancaster, and in 1942 a new, ruthless Supremo appointed as head of Bomber Command, Air Chief Marshal Arthur Harris, the man history would remember as Bomber Harris. On February 14, 1942, the British government issued the area bombing directives to the RAF, giving it the mandate to go after civilian targets as a matter of policy. Harris set about turning Churchill's vision of laneways to Germany into a reality by deciding Lübeck was where he'd test out his new ideas about strategic area bombing first. Although a port, Lübeck was a cultural centre. As such, it was barely defended, and Harris saw in the elegant town a soft, low-risk target. And on March 28, 1942, when seasonal and climatic conditions were favourable, a full moon loomed. Lübeck, quite literally, could not be missed. With so few defences, bombers attacked lower than they'd usually bomb from, devastating the town. Around 62% of all buildings were affected, causing 1,000 casualties and 15,000 people to lose their homes. Nazi Right Minister of Propaganda Joseph Goebbels said the English air raids will have a demoralising effect on the population. The Baedeker Blitz was born. In retaliation, the first city to be attacked was a quiet cathedral city of Exeter, when German bombs smashed into it on the night of April 23rd and 24th, killing 73 civilians. It was a foretaste of what was to come. The day after the raid, German propagandist Baron Gustav von Stumm released a statement that the Nazis would now go out and bomb every building in Britain marked with 3 stars in the Baedeker Guide. A new phrase was born, the Baedeker Blitz. On April 26, after Harris launched another devastating raid against the Baltic port of Rostock, Hitler addressed the Reichstag, promising retribution. I should like to state the following to the whole world. May Churchill not again wail and whimper if I am forced to give a response that will bring much suffering now on I will retaliate blow for blow until this criminal falls. How the guide may have helped Hitler decide which cities to bomb, the books included maps and detailed information on routes, accommodation and attractions, and from 1846 onwards used an innovative star system to rate them, making them very much the first modern tourist guidebooks. It was this star system that Baron von Stumm was referring to when he described how the Nazis would select targets. Here's what the 1937 Guide to Great Britain had to say about three of the cities the Nazis attempted to flatten. The Guide to Destruction. Bath, April 25th to 26, 1942. The chief winter spa in Britain is a handsome city of 68,000 inhabitants and is unrivaled amongst provincial English towns for its combination of archaeological, historic, scenic and social interest. It is a city of crescents and terraces, built in a substantial Palladian style of Bath stone and a rising tier above tier to a height of about 6,000 feet. Bath owes its external appearance largely to the architect John Wood and is an admirable specimen of 18th century town planning. Approximately 417 killed and 19,000 buildings destroyed. Norwich, April 27th and 28th and May 8th and 9th, 1942. The cathedral preserves its original Norman structure more than any other English cathedral. It possesses numerous other interesting buildings. Overall, Norwich is charming, beautiful and especially admirable, as well as going into detail about the many delights Norwich can offer. It also includes a detailed map of the city, showing the position of its Norman castle and cathedral. More than 850 killed, over 20,000 homes destroyed. York, May 28, 29th, 1942. An ancient city with 84,000 inhabitants and the capital of Yorkshire. It is situated on the River Ouse, in the centre of the wide and fertile Vale of York. The ancient walls are still standing. Many of the streets are crooked and narrow. There are quite a few quaint old houses. The map of the city shows the 15th century Guildhall, the Victoria Railway Station and a medieval church. 92 killed, hundreds wounded, 9,500 buildings damaged or destroyed. Saved from the bonfire. The photograph shows German students burning books deemed a threat to the Nazi state in 1933. The Baedeker guides weren't among them, but they were used by Nazi propaganda. The company survived the war and continues to publish to this day. The books torched were those deemed too Jewish, left-wing, pacifist or not German. In reality, this meant anything some local swastika sporting crank decided was immoral ended up on the pyres. Thousands of books were destroyed in this way. Canterbury bombed 3 times in a week. While the last raid most commonly associated with the Baedeker Blitz took place on June 6, when Canterbury, described in the Baedeker Guide as the ecclesiastical metropolis of England, was bombed for the 3rd time in a week. The worst of the raids took place on June 1st and saw 3,600 incendiary bombs and 130 high explosive bombs dropped on it in an attempt to destroy its historic cathedral. In the event, the 11th century architectural masterpiece survived thanks to fire watchers throwing hundreds of incendiary devices from its roof. Much of the city's medieval centre was destroyed, although the Luftwaffe continued to make smaller scale raids on British towns. By the summer of 1942, the Baedeker Blitz was over. Hitler's war machine could ill afford to commit precious resources to an aerial bombing campaign that seemed to have so little effect on the morale of the people it was supposedly terrorising. Britain had endured the Blitz. It had now endured the Baedeker raids, which had killed over 1,600 civilians and destroyed or damaged over 50,000 homes, as well as many buildings of cultural significance. Yet the spirit of its people seemed to be stronger than ever. As a tactic, the area bombing of a civilian population had been proven to be largely ineffective. The British knew this better than anyone, and yet, under Churchill, doggedly persisted with the practice until the end of the war. A well-earned cuppa. Lord Ho-Ho said Exeter was the jewel of the West. We have destroyed that jewel, and the Luftwaffe will return to finish the job. A disproportionate amount of Britain's war effort was given to Bomber Command, as it absorbed shockingly high casualty rates, around 50%, just so that it could mete out what amounted to an increasingly murderous punishment of Germany's people. This policy of annihilation would reach its dreadful climax over Dresden in February 1945. Deadly figures. The devastating numbers behind Nazi Germany's ruthless aerial campaign over Britain from September 1940 to May 1941 injured 51,000, dead 43,000, homeless 2.25 million plus. 965 planes attacked London on September 7, 1940, the first raid of the Blitz. 60% of homes destroyed during the Blitz were in London. 3.5 million people were evacuated to rural areas in Britain during World War II. 25,000 bombs were dropped on the port of London. 2,265 German planes were destroyed during the Blitz. 3,363 German aircrew were killed between 1940 and 41. The final slide. This talk was given in remembrance of my beautiful, amazing wife Margaret, who I loved for 65 years and who always encouraged me to follow my dreams. She had a smile that could light up the world. We are both seen in the House of Lords on March 9, 1993, celebrating